Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Goosebumps talk type of video. And today's topic is a topic I've been dying to cover for some time, and we're going to be looking at the top 5 most invisible Goosebumps books that people never talk about. Now, warning, this might not be the case for everyone. I'm not saying that people haven't had conversations about these books, haven't brought them up to people, casuals or fans alike. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying here with the 5 that I chose is that these are the ones that I think just don't get brought up by the community hardly ever. And what I'm insinuating here is that they've gone basically to the territory in people's minds where I guarantee you, even if you're a longtime fan, what I'm about to show you, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that book, or I remember a little bit about that book, or I remember the cover, but not a lot about the book. And I think that's why these books don't really get brought up in conversation all that much. Is I'm not, like I say, I'm not trying to say that these are forgettable books, but I'm kind of am at the same time. I just feel like there's so many other books out there. I feel. Granted, I haven't read 4 out of the 5 here yet, so I can't really say this in earnest. But I just feel like if there were forgettable Goosebumps books, if I were to put that label, it would be these right here. And like I said, it might be debatable to some. Some might be like, I don't see that book really fitting this list. That's fine. Before we go any further, I want to hear the top 5 Goosebumps books that you feel are invisible in the community. The books that just never get talked about. Okay? And keep the conversation going. But I'm going to go ahead and start my list. Now, my criteria was I eliminated all of the side series stuff that's not representing the main line of Goosebumps. So that pretty much eliminated Tales to Give You Goosebumps, Triple Header, Give Yourself Goosebumps, the IDW Comics, Goosebumps Graphics, the TV show, the TV books. I only stuck to the original 62, Series 2000, Horrorland, Hall of Horrors, Most Wanted, and I was willing to consider Slappy World, but I decided against Slappy World because it's the most recent series, and at the time of making this video, the final book hasn't come out yet. So to avoid recency bias, I left Slappy World alone. So we're basically stuck with the former. Okay. I want to work from the oldest to the newest. Now, I do have some honorable mentions I can go ahead and just throw out. There are some books I considered putting on the list that I didn't. And from the original 62 alone, I think there's about 4. So I guess I'll run them down. Ghost Speech, the book. I know a lot of people bring up the episode. The episode gets made fun of a lot. But the book, when people talk about Ghost Beach, they never talk about the book. Or they'll bring up the ending. Oh, I remember the ending to it. I thought that was kind of cool with the dog. But nobody ever talks about the Sadler kids. Nobody ever talks about the plot of the story. It's just always superficial stuff. Or when people bring it up, they say it's a weak book. And kind of similarly, it came from Beneath the Sink. But it seems to be more positive skewed with that, but it's also the same issue. People always bring up, oh, that's the book with the killer sponge. They don't bring up parts of the story. They don't bring up the main character. I think her name is Kat. None of that. And also, a lot of people bring up the episode when they look at the potato with the teeth. You know, it's just nobody really has intellectual conversations about it. Same thing with Ghost Beach. Then, of course, there's books like Beware the Snowman that people say, oh, that's the other Snowman book, right? Oh, I remember the setting to it. Nothing else. Or they remember the twist involved in the story with, like, the alien stuff, yeah. But it doesn't really go further than that normally. And then Deep Trouble 2. Possibly the most forgettable sequel ever. People say, Fish. Oh, Billy Deep's in it. People don't really talk about those. And then I couldn't really think of any honorable mentions from Series 2000. There are some, but I do see people talking about them. I think Series 2000 is kind of in a renaissance right now. But there were some Horrorland books, like Welcome to Camp Slither. I don't think I've ever seen anybody ever bring that book up in terms of like outside of just saying that it's a fine book. And pretty much the entire Hall of Horror series, I've only ever seen legitimate conversations about the series on like YouTube video comment sections and in the Discord when we're purposely bringing up the series as a whole. So those are some honorable mentions to kind of sink your teeth into. But here's my list. So the first one I want to bring up comes from the original 62, and I definitely think this book is just outright invisible. And I'm perplexed because I talked about this book to one of my friends, one of my coworkers, and he's a casual. And he's told me and recommended books to me in the past. But when I told him about this book, I said, hey, have you ever read this book? And he's like, I didn't even know that book existed. And digging into it, thinking back on it, I don't think I've ever seen anybody bring up this book in a serious conversation. And it's Legend of the Lost Legend. And I pulled out my book 10 version here. And the reason why I think there's some validity to it is I'm willing to bet. If you're a casual out there, I'll be willing to bet most of you, especially if you maybe have only read a handful of the books or maybe you recognize the covers more than anything, you cannot name the character on this cover. Go ahead. If you know the character, pause the video, comment it. I'm waiting. Her name's Ivana. That's the answer. But most people couldn't even tell you that. As a matter of fact, when you think about the story, there's not... most people will tell you it's kind of a forgettable story. Especially when the story is based about forgetfulness. It's ironic, right? I've seen many people put this book in like the D tier. Plenty of people put it in the F tier. Say it's forgettable. Commonly use that adjective about it when it does get brought up. But the amount of times I've seen this book get brought up is probably on one hand. And I've been back into Goosebumps for like almost 4 years. That's kind of depressing for the original 62, probably the most famous series of them all. And you have a book that's gone invisible like this. Yeah. Very sad. But it's not really the worst case on my list here. I think my number 2 is probably the most invisible Goosebumps book of all time. Some people, I want to be shocked if you've never heard of this book. And it comes from Series 2000. What book do you think it is? You might have to think hard, especially if you don't read much Series 2000. It's Scream School, Book 15. The only thing I've ever seen brought up about this book in conversation with people is the element dealing with the main character and the dad. Other than that, nobody ever talks about this book. Nobody ever even mentions the cover. I guess the one intellectual thing I've ever seen brought up about this book is people comparing it to Are You Terrified Yet? And saying that this is the inferior version of it. And that's kind of sad, right? You know, for a Series 2000 book, Series 2000 has a cult following these days. Like I said, it's in a renaissance. A lot of people are talking about them. But you would think that for a 25 book series, technically a 26 book series, that all of them will get brought up. And some do more than others. There are some pretty popular ones that people just love to talk about all the time. But this one, like I said, on one hand, I've ever seen conversations about. Nobody ever talks about it. I don't think a casual even recognized this book or even knew that it existed. So, there's that. Now, the final 3 are from the modern era. And they all come from Horrorland, surprisingly enough. And I do have one Arc 1 book I want to get out the way here. And it's book number 7, My Friends Call Me Monster. Now, some of you might be like, well, Arc 1 Horrorland is at least more popular than Arc 2 Horrorland. And I totally get that, right? But in conversations about Horrorland in general, I normally hear people praise the benchmark books, like books 11 and book 12 from Mark 1, that kind of wrap up the inside of the Horrorland stuff with all the characters from the first 10 books. And if we're talking about the first 10 books, normally it's books 1 through 5. 6 through 10 hardly get talked about. But I dare say that in front of Welcome to Camp Slither, which I had in my honorable mentions, it's this book. Nobody ever talks about this book. I don't know if it's the cover, or people just put it in the back of their minds that this is like an Egg Monsters from Mars clone, or maybe they don't think it's good or something. I couldn't tell you. I've never read this book. And I forgot to mention this. I've never even read Scream School before. That's one of the handful of Series 2000 and original 62 books I haven't read at least once in my life. So I can't really speak too much on it, but I don't think I've ever seen any casual, any fan say that this is one of their favorite books or one of the best or anything. It's just kind of there. Now, some people might think that this book is actually good and might recommend it, but I've never seen people even talk about it or bring it up. I don't know what it is. If you've read it before, you could probably tell me why in the comment section, but yeah, I don't know. Now, at number 4 is a book that same similar situation, except it's an Arc 2 book, and it's book 13, When the Ghost Dog Howls. Is it the cover that reminds people of the Barking Ghost? Honestly, if I was a kid and I read Barking Ghost first, and I didn't own this book, and I went to like a bookstore and I saw this, I wouldn't blame them if everybody associated this book with that, you know? People might just think it's bad, or maybe, I don't know, people just read the book and just forgot about it. I have only ever seen one person ever bring this book up, and they think it's one of their favorite Horrorland books, but other than that, it's never talked about. I know nothing about this plot. I know nothing about what to expect with the book, because nobody seems to care enough to bring it up. And it's just the common theme of all these books. But number 5, I think, is probably the least talked about modern I've seen ever. Right? And it's book number 17 from Horrorland, The Wizard of Ooze. Now, what's perplexing to me about this is that there's always discussion about the Masked Mutant and Dr. Maniac as like the comic-themed Goosebumps villains. But when I look at this book on my shelf, and I think about the back blurb, and they talk about a comic character called the Ooze, it's like that character doesn't even exist in people's brains. Maybe because it's a one-time villain. Maybe because it's Arc 2 Horrorland. I'm willing to say that Arc 2 Horrorland, from books 13 through 19, arguably the most non-talked about Goosebumps books in general. But this one takes the cake, I think. I hardly, if ever, have seen anybody talk about this book other than video reviews. Or if I wanted to, I can go on Goodreads and see typed reviews. But nobody in conversation I've ever seen bring this book up. Not once. And it kind of makes me think that this book has just kind of fallen by the wayside by people. Maybe they think there's better comic stories out there. Maybe they think there's better Horrorland books, better modern books. Couldn't tell you. I do think this book is out of print currently, and that might play a factor into it. I couldn't tell you, but yeah. So, one last time, we're going to go through the books I mentioned. We have Legend of the Lost Legend from the original 62. It's one of the invisible books no one ever talks about. Scream School. Now, these 4 I've never read before. I have read Legend of the Lost Legend before, and I'll be honest, not a big fan, and I can kind of understand why people never talk about it, but Scream School, I've never read it, but people never talk about it. It's kind of invisible. Arguably the most invisible Goosebumps book in the history of Goosebumps. Then we have My Friends Call Me Monster, another invisible one. When the Ghost Dog Howls, and the Wizard of Ooze. Yeah. So that's my list. Let me know down in the comment section, what 5 Goosebumps books do you think are invisible? What 5 Goosebumps books do you think that people just never talk about? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.